of great nations comes the moment of decision, comes the moment of destiny. And this nation again and again in the great hours of its fate has swept aside convention, has swept aside the little men of talk and of delay, and have decided to follow men and movements who say we go forward to action. Let who dare follow us in this hour. That is the permanent, the mighty mood of Britain. And I claim that in the ranks of our black shirt legions march the mighty ghosts of England's past, and their strong arms around us, and their voices echo down the ages, saying onward.
Whenever any revolutionary force takes power or a serious regime change occurs, there's often a conscious and open attempt, at least on the surface, to make a significant break with the pre-existing order. The sentiments of the public can range from fear and trepidation to jubilation about how the new regime will operate, along with speculation about the effect the new regime will have on the lives under its rule. It is no accident that these regime changes and revolutions tend to occur in times of tumult. The period between the two world wars was an era of tremendous economic and social upheaval, embodied in the rise and spread of communism in Eastern Europe and the ascendance of fascism, particularly in Italy, as largely a response to the revolutionary left. The rise of authoritarian rightists movements occurs not only in Italy, but in a number of European countries outside of the Soviet bloc. If ever there was a fascist era, it was surely in the 1920s and 30s, prior to the calamity of World War II. Having examined the conditions that led to the rise of fascism and the ideology of the Italian fascist state, let us turn our eye to the European continent after Mussolini and his followers marched on Rome, and see how this ideology of fascism affected both Italy and surrounding nations. The driving ideological component of the fascist regime, apart from its corporatism, was its nationalism. It should be noted, however, that the fascist conception of the nation is somewhat of a synthetic creation. For if one were to go back even a century before the fascists took power, you wouldn't find a unified Italian people who thought of themselves as such. The common tongue of the Italians did serve to help unify them and foster a form of national cohesion. But it is also true that, to a certain extent, what held the erstwhile competing Italian states together was that they had more in common amongst themselves than those outside their borders, and that the national unity of a Venetian and Sicilian was predicated on them being less different than, say, an Austrian or German. The 19th century was a century of both Italian and German unification, and could be described as a century of the nation-state, where for pragmatic reasons of continental competition, a number of European nations cohered into singular states, unifying the different independent republics, kingdoms, and principalities. The alternative to this perspective would be to speculate that the seeds of the nation were somehow sown into the people, and that in a romantic sense, the emergent nation-state was the fulfillment of some unified national destiny. This wasn't a million miles away from what the fascists themselves believed, who saw their Latin heritage as an integral part of who they were and the fascist project more generally. The fascist regime partially saw itself as a successor to the Roman Empire of old and encouraged the cultural identity of Romanitas. It would eventually seek to recreate a modern Roman imperium of sorts by attempting to build a strong, modern, Mediterranean-centered empire on top of the territories they already possessed in the mid-1930s. On the way to realizing this goal, the regime's first step was to quell unrest in their pre-existing colony of Libya, before later invading Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, in 1935 from their Eritrean colony. Mussolini would later use his junior partner status with Germany in the Second World War as an opportunity to gain further territory along the eastern coast of the Adriatic and sections of North Africa. This harkening back to Roman greatness was persistent throughout the entire fascist movement, with the very name and symbol of the fascist regime coming from the fasces of ancient Rome. It was a symbol of high office consisting of a bundle of rods bound together and from which protruded the blade of an axe, signifying strength through unity, collective power, law, and governance. Prior to the Great Depression or its military adventurism, things initially improved for Italy economically and on the social front. The mass socialist disturbances had been quelled. The corporatist model of fascism was to theoretically structure the Italian economy in an essentially modern guild system of industry and labor. Theoretically, the interests of both would be harmonized and put to the use of benefiting the nation and fulfilling the general directives of the state, which would function as arbiter. Despite the socialist origins of many of fascism's founding members, they did not carry out Bolshevik-style nationalization of industry, but rather formed national syndicates of different business groups, which was somewhat similar to what the Roosevelt administration would later do during the Great Depression. There was an attempt to create planned industrial harmony, which was in contrast to the notion of spontaneous order, which you find in Austrian economics. These syndicates went under such names as the National Fascist Confederation of Commerce and the National Fascist Confederation of Credit and Insurance, etc. Above these were formed government-planned agencies called corporations for each industry, which would try to set sector goals and function as mediator. The goal was economic nationalism. However, the revolving door between state and business, particularly in the military industry, became widely acknowledged as a vector of corruption even at the time. The top-down directives of the fascist state would largely come as a means of dealing with economic problems, especially with the onset of the Great Depression following the stock market crash of 1929. Eventually, by 1934, and attempting to deal with the Depression, Mussolini stated, or perhaps bragged, that 3/4 of the Italian economy had been subsidized or, quote, was in the hands of the state. This was largely due to the government taking over too-big-to-fail institutions, which had crumbled during the Depression. The state provided funding through the Treasury to bail out the banks and created the Institute for Industrial Reconstruction, or IRI, in 1934, which took over ownership or partial ownership of firms that were bank-owned through government-linked companies, including 3 of the most important and too-big-to-fail Italian banks. The IRI was essentially an organ by which the state could engage in business rescue on a mass scale, and it persisted until 2002. Throughout its existence, the economy of fascist Italy essentially functioned as a mixed economy, with the state reserving the right to intervene while maintaining private enterprise. The business and climate improved after the vanquishing of a credible leftist threat, and business confidence somewhat revived with the banishment of mass socialism and more regime certainty. Once order had been reestablished among organized labor, there was a period of economic liberalization, which saw moderate success. However, when the value of the lira dropped and the economy began to face trouble, the state intervened, predictably resulting in some inefficiencies and an increasing size of the bureaucracy. With characteristic bravado, Mussolini announced the Battle of the Lira, the aim of which was to bring down inflation and strengthen the currency. There was also the Battle for Grain, where Mussolini sought to increase grain yields, make Italy self-sufficient in grain, and lower its trade deficit. There was also the Battle for Land, which was a large land reclamation project to drain marshes, improve public health, and create more arable or developable land, which resulted in an additional 80,000 hectares of viable reclaimed land. Aside from the stated goals of these battles, these economic programs served as make-work or employment opportunities in a similar way the U.S. federal government would do when they created the Works Progress Administration in 1935. Welfare expenditure was increased in addition to the creation of public works and infrastructure projects to help alleviate some of the effects of unemployment and declines in investment during the Depression, which followed typical Keynesian prescriptions. The economic interventionism of the fascists, while substantial, was not unique to the times. The fascist regime was keen on communicating to the business community that they were not interested in Bolshevik-style seizures of property by saying such things as, private property is a sacred right under fascism, and that it was in the interest of the nation to have and preserve private enterprise. There were factions of the Arditi and more radical fascists which advocated national syndicalism, in which everybody, including industrialists, would have to organize into a labor union under the fascist state. Such notions, in the words of Dr. Paul Gottfried, quote, went absolutely nowhere and were thoroughly sidelined in the discussions between the state and industry when they formed the Labor Charter of 1927, or Carta de Lavoro. This legislative document gave some concessions to labor on the one hand, while quieting the anxieties of Italian industrialists on the other. Gottfried also argues that the interventions of the fascists in the economy were perhaps less dramatic than those taken in the 1930s under the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, and that certainly the tone and attitude of the FDR government was in some ways more unpredictable and hostile to industry than the fascist regime. And certainly neither government could be confused as laissez-faire, 19th century style administrations with hard money and unfettered markets. Both the Italian and American governments embarked on major status measures to deal with the economic problems that beset them, like erecting protectionist trade restrictions and championing state-backed efforts to keep wages up in a deflationary environment. It should also be noted that Mussolini's economic policies did serve as something of a template for the New Dealers in the Roosevelt administration. In fact, Mussolini received regular and open praise from such people as Hugh S. Johnson, head of the National Recovery Administration, and President Roosevelt himself, who called Mussolini that admirable Italian gentleman prior to the invasion of Ethiopia. Indeed, the New Dealers seemed intent on taking the lessons they'd learned from Mussolini and dialing them up while being, in some ways, socially and economically more radical than the fascists, and certainly grander in scale. The U.S., under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, moved into a clearly new social order, constructed of a democratic welfare state, greater centralization than the federal government, and labor legislation representing a decisive taking of sides against enterprise in a manner simply not seen with the comparatively conciliatory Carta de Lavoro of the Italian fascists. The fact that fascism had functioned somewhat as an economic model for the American government during the New Deal era is a testament to the convincing nature of fascist ideas at the time and helped promote a positive image of the ideology internationally. This proved a valuable asset for fascist internationalism, which was, at least for time, a not insignificant ideological clique within the fascist circles. There was a segment of the fascists who were thoroughgoing internationalists or pan-European. Fascism's status as an ascendant, oppositional force to the rising Bolsheviks, and a break from the previous order that led to the Great War made it at least plausibly a prime commodity for export. The book Fascism, The Career of a Concept by Paul Gottfried goes into detail highlighting this internationalist trend among certain fascists. Prominent fascist Esvero Gravelli, quote, contended fascism was helping overcome the ideological misconceptions of liberalism and liberal democracy that had arisen from the French Revolution, close quote. Gravelli and others affirmed that, quote, Italian fascism will be the auxiliary agent to the rise and self-assertion of analogous movements in other countries, close quote. Significantly, Gravelli and other fascist internationalists called permanent revolution to be a leftist as well as a fascist principle. However, this feeling was by no means held among all fascists, including Mussolini. From Fascism, The Career of a Concept, page 118, quote, needless to say, the call for completing the national revolution at home, which came from Bottai, Gravelli, Spirito, and other militants, did not please Mussolini, as he was working to appease his already insecure subjects in the wake of the Depression. His decision to remove some of the exponents of permanent revolution from high places in the 1930s may have issued from his fear of rocking the boat as Italy plunged into high unemployment and serious economic setbacks, along with the rest of Europe and the United States, close quote. The revolutionary fervor of Gravelli aside, there were at least token efforts made by the regime to advance the notion of fascist internationalism outside of its borders. Perhaps the biggest partner and champion of international fascism outside of Italy may have been British aristocrat turned founder of the British Union of Fascists, Oswald Mosley. Mosley had developed ties with the Italian regime and used their help to get his British Union of Fascists started by taking £60,000 from Mussolini to spearhead fascism in the UK. He was a major advocate of fascist internationalism and dedicated to European unity, both during the interwar period and after. Mosley was also a proponent of economic planning, while maintaining private property, in a manner not totally dissimilar from how the European Union operates today. His experience as a World War I combat veteran prompted his desire for fascistic European unity, an attempt to stave off another conflict and stand against Bolshevism. Enthusiastic as he may have been, however, this authoritarian modernizer was something of a fish out of water in the UK, as his fascist project ultimately led nowhere. This is partially because the Italian fascists' history were as nationalist revolutionaries, and so they predictably failed at redefining themselves as internationalists. Despite the rhetoric of some of the radical elements, the fascists made no major headway as an internationalist rival to the revolutionary left. The internationalism of fascism was tacked on, while for the left it was integral. There were also cultural and social reasons for why fascism wouldn't take off in a country like the United Kingdom. The country was too dissimilar in circumstance and temperament from its Italian counterpart in a number of important ways. The countries in which fascism took power or had a major presence possessed a number of things in common which the UK did not have. While Italy was the only country to have a pure ideological fascist regime, the movement was nevertheless popular in Latin Catholic countries, particularly. The Falange in Spain started off as a fascist party in 1933, shortly before the Spanish Civil War. Once the war began in 1936, General Francisco Franco quickly made alliance with the Falange before becoming its leader and then eventually purging it of the fascist element and operating as an authoritarian, explicitly pro-Catholic military dictator of Spain. There was also a fascist contingent in Portugal, which was crushed by Antonio Salazar, who denounced fascism as pagan Caesarism, but nevertheless shared some similarities with the phenomenon, and that his regime was an openly authoritarian one, which attempted to employ a corporatist model as well. Salazar's corporatism, however, was rooted in Catholic social teaching, found in Rerum Novarum, a famous papal encyclical from Pope Leo XIII. On a philosophical level, the Portuguese Estado Novo regime was also at odds with Giovanni Gentile and Mussolini's cult of the state. And, like Francisco Franco, Salazar's regime was explicitly pro-Catholic from the beginning. Another regime that in some ways mirrored Salazar's Estado Novo and the Italian fascists was the Fatherland Front in Austria under Engelbert Dollfuss. This regime ruled in a similar manner as Estado Novo by adopting corporatism and an explicitly pro-Catholic policy, but was organized similarly to the fascist regime in Italy and ruled the nation of Austria from 1934 until it was absorbed by the Nazi Germans in 1938. The only non-Catholic country to ever have a serious fascist presence was Romania, an Eastern Orthodox Latin country. Fascism came to Romania under the likes of Corneliu Condrianu, Alexander Cuza, and Ion Matza. However, unlike in Italy, Spain, Austria, or Portugal, fascism in Romania did have an anti-Semitic element missing from normative fascism elsewhere. The anti-Semitism found among Romanian fascists, who were certainly very hostile to Jews, was of a different sort, though, than in Nazi Germany, being non-racial in nature and rooted in pre-existing tensions between Romanian peasantry and a Jewish shopkeeper class. Romanian fascists built the League for Christian Defense in 1923 and Legion of the Archangel Michael in 1927. The group merged Latin authoritarian doctrines, corporatism, local social problems, and Romanian nationalism into a virulent movement within Romanian politics. Compared to a place like Austria, Romania was a poor, rural country which had stressed its Latin roots since independence in the 1860s. The Legion of the Archangel Michael eventually became known as the Iron Guard, which simultaneously carried out a particularly brutal pogrom and rebellion in 1941, which was put down by the Antonescu government, which destroyed the organization. Romania, Portugal, Spain, and Italy were all Latin countries with older hierarchical forms of Christianity. They were also all Catholic nations with the exception of Orthodox Romania. They were also traditionally monarchies who had short, turbulent, and failed republics prior to World War II, and were comparatively poorer, more rural, and less industrialized than the countries of Northern Europe. The exception to this pattern was, of course, Germanic Austria, which, like the Spanish and Portuguese regimes, wasn't exactly fascist in the manner of Mussolini's regime, although the term Austro-fascist or clerical fascist has been applied to it. There were ideological and cosmetic reasons for why these other regimes didn't perfectly fit the Italian mold. For one thing, all these regimes lacked the fascist ideology of the state. The mystical, almost religious language of the state was absent from these movements and regimes, although they may have adopted some of the tactics of fascism in gaining power, or attempt to gain power in the case of the Romanian Iron Guard. They also stood against both liberalism and the socialist left, were explicitly authoritarian, nationalistic, and embraced some form of corporatism in their economic ideology. However, to call the supposedly clerical fascist regimes of Austria or Portugal as perfectly analogous to Mussolini's government would be to detract from what made the Italian phenomenon unique. These regimes also came into power under quite different circumstances than Mussolini's. The Austrian Fatherland Front came into power in 1933 after Austria's Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss dissolved parliament following a constitutional crisis. Spain was a military dictatorship, which took on the trappings of the Phalange for a time, as it needed during the Spanish Civil War. The Portuguese Estado Novo started as a military dictatorship before passing power to Antonio Salazar, with the National Union Party of Salazar being a product of the state, rather than the other way round. Romania was a constitutional monarchy and later monarchical dictatorship right before the Second World War, which never had a fascist government, although the regime there would ally itself to the Third Reich in the Second World War. The various power struggles in these countries played out quite differently to the mass political mobilization and counter-socialist street battles found in Italy. These fascist-adjacent movements were also largely populated by people who were in some senses at odds with the perceived paganism of certain intellectuals associated with fascism. From Fascism, the Creator Concept, page 111, quote, "The tension between clerical fascists and neo-pagan fascists, who occasionally sported Catholic colors, became dramatically apparent when conservative Austrian Catholics who lined up with the Austro-Fascisten attacked the fascist international journal Anti-Europa, launched by Mussolini's longtime friend Svero Gravelli in 1929. Whereas Gravelli and his associates were against the old Europeanisms while working to generate support for fascist teachings, the Austrian Catholic journal Schönere Zukunft accused the editors of preaching the neo-pagan doctrines of Giulio Evola. Austrian critics charged these fascist publicists with standing close to Evola in their beliefs and proceeding from post-Hegelian idealism in their own particular manner." Close quote. It is clear that the Austrian clerical fascists were at odds with Giovanni Gentile's philosophy of fascism and Julius Evola's neo-paganism, both of which they saw at odds with the traditional Catholic social order they wished to preserve. Practically speaking, though, the regimes of Austria and Portugal weren't altogether different from the Italian model in execution, save for some of the imperial ambitions of Mussolini's regime. Indeed, Austria itself was supported and allied to fascist Italy. In practice, what makes much of fascism stand out from other right-wing authoritarian regimes, both now and during the interwar period, was its aesthetics, that and its corporatism. With the growing power and virulence of the Third Reich in the years leading up to the Second World War, however, fascism itself, along with the rest of Europe, would be thrown into chaos. The rise of Nazism and the regime of Adolf Hitler soon would make their mark on Europe, take Italy as its junior partner, stamp out other competing power groups, including fascist ones, and become known as the fascist regime and model for fascism in execution. But this begs the question: to what extent was the classification of the Nazi movement as truly fascist accurate, and in what ways was it both similar and radically different from normative Italian fascism.